Couple of days ago, BC Premier David Eby was in the media commenting on Alberta Premier Danielle Smith's announcement that her government would be heading up a proposal, an application to build a pipeline from Alberta to the British Columbia West Coast. And the technical advisory group includes three pipeline companies and some indigenous groups. And in about 6 months, they think they'll have a proposal together. And so Eby said, well, there's really nothing to comment on because there is no proponent, which is not exactly true because Alberta says it's going to be the proponent. And he said there's no application, which is technically true because they said, they'll have it ready in 6 months. Okay. So a lot of, comments for domestic consumption because frankly, when Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline was built out to Burnaby in southern BC, started 10 years ago, there was intense opposition. And already environmental groups and municipal groups and a number of First Nations have come out and said they're going to be opposed to any new pipeline. So Eby's, tending to his politics. That's what you have to do. Here's what Jason Kenney, former Premier of Alberta, had to say about Eby's remarks. He said it in a tweet. David Eby is objectively a much bigger threat to confederation and to the rule of law than Alberta separatists. Eby is actively undermining the Canadian Constitution and his ideological hostility to pipelines and doing real damage to national unity and prosperity in the process. Now, that's a lot of, hyperbole right there. And you have to understand that Jason Kenney, back in the days before 2006, when he was in opposition with the federal Conservatives in the House of Commons, and Stephen Harper, the leader of the party, Kenney was Harper's attack dog. When the Harper wanted to clap back against the opposition, he would turn Kenney loose, and Kenney would do his thing. And that's nothing unusual. I mean, the Liberals have done it, the NDP have done it. It's quite common in the House of Commons. So that's not a big deal. But then Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, she had some comments about Eby's. And she was in the media complaining about it. And then she mused that it was too bad that Alberta, when, Alberta's borders were drawn up when it became a province in 1905, that they weren't drawn such that the province had access to a port within its jurisdiction, which would make for a very odd map. But nevertheless, given the fact that BC had already been a province for 33 years, unlikely. But she was making the point that she had a little jab at Eby. And then, so here we are, we're setting up for the battle. Everyone knew it was coming after Prime Minister Mark Carney has mused publicly about there being a pipeline somewhere in the announcements around projects of national interest under the One Canadian Act, a Canadian Economy Act. We knew this was coming. So who has the hammer here? Well, Kenney goes on to explain exactly who does. And it's the federal government. And when Trans Mountain Expansion was being planned and then the early work was being done, the city of Burnaby was harassing, they wouldn't approve permits in a timely fashion, and they were trying to slow down the Kinder Morgan, the project proponent in its construction. And the National Energy Board what is the regulator here, and so it was supervising the process, and so the company went to the NEB. Now, here's what you need to know. Under the Constitution of Canada, the federal government, the senior government, has the authority to regulate and approve works that cross provincial lines. And so the city of Burnaby said that no, that didn't apply, and their local municipal authority should be respected. The NEB is also the regulator, because now we have it has a different name, Canadian Energy Regulator. The regulator is also a superior court. And so what the NEB did is twice it ruled on issues around jurisdiction. Once with the city of Burnaby, and then another time with the government of British Columbia. Both times, the NEB came back in its role as a superior court and said that the federal government had exclusive jurisdiction, paramountcy it's called, which basically when the federal government and a provincial government, when their legislation clashes, then the federal government has paramountcy. It takes precedent. And so those were appealed. They went up all the way to the Federal Court of Appeal, I think, and they were dismissed. They lost because it's now widely recognized. This is the precedent that for sure the federal government has the hammer when it comes to deciding if a pipeline will be built. It doesn't matter what municipal governments think. It doesn't matter what the provincial government thinks. And very controversially, it doesn't matter what Indigenous communities of First Nations think. Now, I know that's going to upset some people, but the fact is that this issue came up with Trans Mountain expansion, and the decision at the time of the federal government, unless Carney takes a different position, is that First Nations don't have a veto in this process. Certainly, they're under Section 35. They have to be consulted. That has to be done. It has to be done to certain standards that have already been set by legal precedent. That's accepted, but they don't get to say no. So basically, the federal government has the hammer, and if it's willing to take the political heat for forcing a pipeline on British Columbia, it can legally make sure that that pipeline gets built, as it did with Trans Mountain expansion. It's not that different. Okay, so here's the issue here. The Peter Lougheed, a former Alberta premier, 1971 to 1986, is an icon in the politics. The Alberta oil sands exists because he took the initiative and his government invested in it and created AOSTRA, which developed a lot of the technology that was required. He is the one that's responsible for the development of petrochemical industry near Edmonton. He is the one he used the regulation and public ownership as a way to further develop and get more value added, diversify the economy of Alberta. A lot of Alberta's current prosperity can be traced back to the work that Premier Lougheed did. Now, here's the thing. Lougheed has 6 principles on how to govern. And one of them is practice statescraft. That is, that you have to be good at politics. You have to build coalitions. You have to build partnerships. You have to be clever in the way you present yourself publicly. Maybe you don't want to inflame your opposition at this particular time, or you get my drift. I mean, we can see politicians who practice statescraft, and then we can see politicians, like Mark Carney versus, Donald Trump, for example, president of the U.S. And in this particular case, Eby was doing he was practicing statescraft. This is what you're doing. You're talking to your domestic your constituency and reassuring them that the provincial government will take the same position it took last time. Danielle Smith and Jason Kenney, when he was premier, do not practice statescraft. And Kenney, I think, was a little more astute in the way he did this, because he was as virulent as Smith in publicly opposing everything that Ottawa did. Not a sparrow would drop, but it got blamed on Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Meanwhile, though, because he had experience as a federal cabinet minister, behind the scenes, his bureaucrats were talking to federal bureaucrats and they would get stuff done. And I guess it was just acknowledged that, Kenney had to play to his domestic audience in Alberta. Smith isn't that. I mean, I give Smith a lot of credit for having to be politically savvy, but this is pretty clumsy politics on her part. Again, poking the eye of all of your opponents on behalf of Alberta. For what? To what end? Maybe, she gets some political benefit in Alberta for that. Oh, we're standing up to British Columbia. We're standing up to Ottawa. Come on, folks. This is big business here. And the Peter Lougheed said it best. You have to practice statescraft. What Smith and Kenney are doing is not statescraft, not even very good politics outside of Alberta. And this is interesting because I'm actually opposed to the pipeline. Here at Energy Media, we've taken a position that with peak oil demand coming in 2030 and a decline likely coming between 2030 and 2035, now is not the time to be building 50-year infrastructure for crude oil. Particularly when your target customer is over in Asia, where China is leading the electrification of the Asian economies. And first thing they electrify is transportation, which is, half of all of the oil that gets consumed. So we're opposed to the pipeline. So when I'm criticizing Smith and Kenney for this, it's because this is how politics has been played in Alberta since 2019. And if there's anybody who's destructive, anybody who's impeding or damaging the Canadian Constitution, it's those two and many others in Alberta. And so this is a really bad idea. And it's time for Jason Kenney to just butt out again. He came back from exile after getting punted in 2022, maybe a year ago, and he was very diplomatic. It was very different Kenney, and he was getting a lot of kudos for it. And the last month or two, the attack dog Kenney has surfaced again. We need the other guy to come back. We need the statesman Kenney to the extent that he can. This attack dog doesn't work. And Smith is still an attack dog in her own right. That really needs to moderate. So you're damaging, you're basically shooting yourself in the foot, Mr. Kenney and Premier Smith. This makes absolutely no sense. But, as somebody who opposes the pipeline to begin with, have at it.